Here's a compelling introduction for your YouTube video story. Imagine stepping onto a flight, excited for your journey, only to be met with hostility instead of hospitality. That's exactly what happened to one elderly woman when she boarded a plane, expecting a peaceful trip. She had no idea that a simple misunderstanding would turn into public humiliation. But here's the twist. Neither did the flight attendant, who had no clue just how powerful this woman really was. It started like any other day at the airport. Passengers were lining up, finding their seats, and preparing for takeoff. Among them was an older black woman, dressed modestly but carrying herself with quiet confidence. She moved slowly, carefully placing her belongings in the overhead bin before settling into her seat. But before she could even relax, a stern voice interrupted her. A flight attendant, young and impatient, was standing over her with an irritated look. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong seat," she snapped, not even bothering to check the woman's ticket properly. The elderly woman politely responded, explaining that this was, in fact, her assigned seat. But the flight attendant wasn't listening. Her tone grew sharper. "You need to move now," she demanded. Other passengers began to glance over, sensing tension in the air. The woman remained calm, trying once again to show her ticket. But instead of checking it, the flight attendant sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "If you don't move, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." A murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, while others just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The elderly woman sat still for a moment, looking the flight attendant in the eyes. There was no anger, no panic, just quiet strength. And then, with the slightest smile, she said something that made the entire situation take an unexpected turn. What she revealed would leave the flight attendant speechless, the passengers stunned, and the airline itself scrambling to fix a massive mistake. Because this woman wasn't just any passenger, she was someone with enough power to change everything. Stay tuned, because what happens next is a lesson in humility, respect, and why you should never judge someone based on appearances. The flight attendant crossed her arms, waiting for the elderly woman to stand up. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something about this moment didn't feel right. A few even whispered to each other, wondering why the situation had escalated so quickly. But the woman remained calm. She took a slow breath, glanced down at her ticket once more, and then looked back up at the flight attendant with a knowing expression. "I think you should check that again," she said gently, her voice steady but firm. The flight attendant let out a frustrated sigh and snatched the ticket from the woman's hand. She barely looked at it before shaking her head. "This isn't your seat. You need to leave, or we'll have to call security," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Passengers exchanged glances. A man sitting nearby leaned in, trying to get a better look at the ticket. I think she's actually in the right seat," he mumbled, pointing at the number on the ticket. The flight attendant ignored him, already waving over another crew member. "We have a problem here," she said, her voice filled with authority, as if she was handling a major security threat. The second crew member, a middle-aged man, approached and glanced between the two women. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone neutral. "She won't move," the flight attendant snapped. "I've asked her several times." The elderly woman let out a small sigh and shook her head. She could see exactly what was happening. She had been in boardrooms where people dismissed her, in meetings where her words were overlooked, and in negotiations where people assumed she didn't belong, until they realized who she was. And now, here she was, on her own airline, being told she had no place. The second crew member hesitated. Something about the woman's expression made him pause. He glanced at her ticket and then at the flight attendant, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," the flight attendant insisted, exasperated. "She needs to leave. Now." The woman tilted her head slightly, watching the scene unfold. She could have ended it right then and there. She could have spoken up, told them exactly who she was, and watched the flight attendant scramble to take back her words. But she didn't. Instead, she let the moment play out, because she wanted to see just how far they would take this. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A woman a few rows back took out her phone, subtly recording the interaction. Others shifted in their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, just as security was about to be called, the woman calmly reached into her bag and pulled out something that would change everything. The flight attendant, still unaware of the mistake she was making, had no idea that in just a few moments, her entire world was about to turn upside down. The elderly woman slowly unzipped her leather handbag, her movements deliberate and calm. The flight attendant tapped her foot impatiently, arms still crossed, convinced she had won this battle. But the passengers weren't so sure anymore. The way the woman carried herself, the way she remained unbothered despite the growing tension, it was enough to make them wonder if there was more to her than met the eye. From her bag, the woman pulled out a sleek black envelope, its edges crisp and expensive-looking. She placed it gently on her lap, running a hand over it as if deciding whether or not to open it. The second crew member, still standing nearby, seemed to sense something was off. He leaned in slightly. "Ma'am, what's in the envelope?" he asked, his tone softer than before. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted her eyes to the flight attendant, who was still standing stiffly, clearly ready to call security if necessary. The woman studied her for a moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "You really have no idea, do you?" she murmured, shaking her head. The flight attendant bristled. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this flight is on a schedule. If you don't comply, you will be removed." A ripple of murmurs spread across the cabin. Some passengers were growing visibly uncomfortable, while others watched intently, their curiosity piqued. A businessman in first class peeked over the divider, raising an eyebrow. A young woman a few seats away whispered to her companion, both of them glued to the unfolding drama. Just then, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're just finishing up final preparations for takeoff. Please ensure you are in your assigned seats and have your seat belts fastened." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman was exactly where she was supposed to be, yet she was the only one being told to move. The second crew member must have realized this, because his expression shifted, his doubt growing. He turned to the flight attendant. "Maybe we should double-check before we escalate this any further." The flight attendant shot him an annoyed glance. "I know what I'm doing," she snapped. "She's just trying to make a scene." At that, the elderly woman finally opened the black envelope. She pulled out a single official-looking document and held it up for them to see. The moment the second crew member's eyes landed on it, his face paled. He blinked, then looked at the woman in a completely different light. The flight attendant, however, still hadn't caught on. "What is that?" "Some kind of complaint form," she scoffed. The woman sighed, giving her a patient smile. "Not quite," she said, tilting the document so the words were clearly visible. The businessman in first class, who had been watching the entire time, suddenly gasped. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath. The second crew member took a small step back, looking almost nervous now. "Ma'am, I didn't realize." But before he could finish, the flight attendant yanked the paper from the woman's hand and glanced at it. For a second, she didn't react. Then, as the words sank in, her smirk disappeared. Her posture stiffened. Her face lost its color. Because right there, printed in bold, unmistakable letters, was a title that changed everything. Owner and Chief Executive Officer. Passengers began to murmur louder now, some leaning forward, others whispering in shock. A man near the window let out a low whistle. The young woman recording the incident covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed, her brain scrambling to process what she had just read. But before she could say anything, the elderly woman gently took the document back, tucking it into her envelope once more. Then she folded her hands in her lap, looking up at the flight attendant with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. "Well," she said, her voice steady, "now that we have that cleared up, what would you like to do next?" The entire plane fell silent, everyone waiting to see how the flight attendant would respond. But there was no easy way out of this now. The woman she had dismissed, the woman she had treated with such impatience and disrespect, wasn't just another passenger. She owned the airline. And she was waiting for an answer. The flight attendant stood frozen, gripping the document as if holding it tighter would somehow change what it said. Her eyes darted from the paper to the woman sitting before her, then to the second crew member, who now looked completely stunned. The passengers were no longer just watching. They were fully invested, their eyes bouncing between the two women like they were witnessing something straight out of a movie. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across the flight attendant's face. Her confidence, once so sharp, was now slipping. But still, she didn't back down. She started, her voice uneven, but she quickly stopped herself. She was realizing, far too late, that she had made a mistake. A massive one. The elderly woman, still calm, leaned back slightly in her seat. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. If anything, she seemed almost disappointed. "It's interesting," she said softly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "How quickly people judge when they think they have authority." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on the flight attendant's chest. Her breath hitched and she swallowed hard. She could feel the eyes on her, passengers watching, waiting to see what she would do next. The second crew member finally spoke, his voice careful. "I think we should." Before he could finish, another voice interrupted, a deeper, more authoritative one. "What's going on here?" Heads turned as the captain of the flight stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He had clearly been informed that something was happening, but as his eyes landed on the elderly woman, something changed in his face. His posture straightened, his brows lifted just slightly, and he immediately seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The flight attendant stepped aside quickly, as if instinctively moving out of the way. She opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to justify, but before she could say anything, the elderly woman finally rose from her seat. She didn't stand like someone who had been humiliated. She stood like someone in control, someone who had been through worse and come out stronger. Slowly, she smoothed the front of her blouse, then looked at the captain. "Captain," she greeted him, her tone steady. "Ma'am," the captain responded, nodding slightly in respect. "Is there an issue here?" She let out a small breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "It seems there's been some confusion," she said. The flight attendant stiffened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She could feel it slipping. Whatever power she thought she had in this moment was slipping right through her fingers. She wasn't the one in control anymore. The captain's eyes flickered between the two women before landing on the flight attendant. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had tried to remove the one person on this flight who had more power than anyone else. A heavy silence filled the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity growing into something else. Anticipation. They knew something big was about to happen. The elderly woman held the captain's gaze for a moment longer before slowly turning back to the flight attendant. "I'd like to know," she said, her voice still as calm as ever, "why you assumed I didn't belong here." The question cut through the air like a blade. The flight attendant's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. There was no excuse, no explanation that would make sense now. Passengers leaned in. Some clutched their armrests. Even the businessman in first class had set his drink down, completely focused. The moment stretched, the weight of it pressing down on the flight attendant, on the entire plane. The elderly woman waited, her expression unreadable. And then, just when the tension felt unbearable, the captain shifted slightly. His next words would decide everything. Just then, before she could stammer out an excuse, another voice cut through the silence, this time from the front of the plane. "Excuse me. A man in a suit rushed down the aisle, his steps hurried. The moment the elderly woman saw him, a knowing smile tugged at her lips. The man was the airline's regional director. His name tag glinted under the cabin lights as he practically stumbled toward them, his face pale. "Miss Moore," he breathed, addressing the elderly woman directly, his voice laced with panic. "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding." Passengers gasped. A few exchanged glances. They had known the elderly woman was important, but now it was clear just how high up she was. The regional director's presence confirmed that this was bigger than a simple seating dispute. The flight attendant visibly stiffened. "Our regional director Carter," she stammered, stepping back. He ignored her, his attention solely on the elderly woman. "Please accept my sincerest apologies," he continued. "This is not how we treat our most valued passengers, and certainly not our leadership." His voice wavered slightly, as if he couldn't believe this was actually happening. Miss Moore, still composed, simply tilted her head. "Is that so?" she asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems this is exactly how I was treated." The tension was unbearable now. The flight attendant looked like she wanted to disappear. The captain's jaw tightened. Passengers were whispering more openly now, some even shaking their heads at what they were witnessing. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse to the flight attendant, Ms. Moore reached into her bag once again. This time, she pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward them, showing a live video feed. The passengers in the rows closest to her craned their necks, their eyes widening as they realized what they were seeing. The incident, the entire confrontation, was being streamed live. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant's breath hitched as she realized what this meant. This wasn't just a bad... Miss Moore raised a single eyebrow. "Handle it?" she repeated, her voice cool. "What does that mean exactly?" The director hesitated, glancing at the captain as if looking for backup. But the captain remained silent, waiting, letting Miss Moore take the lead. She let out a quiet sigh and then, to everyone's surprise, offered the flight attendant a small, almost knowing smile. "I could have you removed from this flight," she said evenly. "I could have you fired on the spot." The flight attendant flinched but said nothing. The passengers held their breath. Some had expected this outcome all along. "But," Ms. Moore continued, tilting her head slightly, "I think that would be too easy." The flight attendant blinked, confusion flickering across her face. The regional director straightened. Even the captain seemed intrigued. Miss Moore let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "Instead," she said, "I'd like you to remain on this flight. In fact, I insist on it." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant's lips parted in surprise. You want me to stay?" she asked hesitantly. Miss Moore nodded. "Yes, because I want you to think about this moment, every single second of this flight. I want you to look at every passenger on board and ask yourself if you would have treated them the same way you treated me. I want you to serve, to do your job, knowing exactly who I am, and knowing that I'm watching." The weight of those words sank in, heavy and inescapable. The flight attendant looked down, swallowing hard. "And when we land," Ms. Moore continued, her voice steady, "you and I will have a conversation, a real one, about whether you still belong in this airline at all." The finality of her words sent a chill through the air. The regional director nodded quickly. "Of course, Ms. Moore. We will discuss everything upon arrival." The flight attendant gave a small, stiff nod. She knew there was nothing else she could do. She turned on her heel and walked quickly to the galley, her presence shrinking as she disappeared from view. Passengers broke into hushed whispers. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded in quiet approval. Miss Moore, however, simply sat back down, crossing her legs as if nothing had happened at all,